The stated goal of the IMF and the World Bank, as stated on their website, to collaborate closely on country assistance and policy issues that are relevant for both institutions, and to conduct country missions in parallel and participate in each other's missions, in which their assessments of a country's general economic situation and policies will provide input to the bank's assessments of potential development projects or reforms. What does that mean exactly? Why haven't they done it? And why is this ex-employee of the World Bank, Karen Hughes, saying,
Now, I was hired into the World Bank, and I have maintained credibility with the ministers of finance. One of the reasons that this interview may come as a surprise to many people, the original intention of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund has not been followed. We have got a system of paper currencies. Are we going to have a revolution? They have captured the politicians and thought that they were above the law.
Coming up in this edition of The Economic Divide, we'll zoom in on the IMF World Bank's most recent October meeting.
Ending poverty by 2030.
We have written everything down and we will hold you to it. Thank you.
We heard this morning from the European Commission and from the United States.
I see the issuance that took place today that was massively oversubscribed. There is still a lot to be done. Program is not over.
Why have their focus areas like infrastructure, inequality, or financial stability failed, including their debt restructuring, mostly driven by austerity? More importantly, why is IMF lending only to programs that apparently hurt the poor while allowing big corporations to flourish? All of that coming up shortly. The IMF and the World Bank. Originally, it was designed to promote international economic cooperation and to provide member countries with loans so that they could trade with other countries. That's the short end of it. But since the debt crisis that really started back in the 80s, they are now acting like a global loan shark, exerting enormous leverage over the economies of more than 60 countries, including their politics. Two of the most powerful institutions on earth, yet few know how it works. The Bretton Woods Monetary Conference, July 1944. Reps from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. They established the World Bank and set the gold standard at $35 an ounce. The U.S. Secretary of the Treasury addressed the delegates at the conference. The chief feature of the Bretton Woods system was an obligation for each country to adopt a monetary policy by tying its currency to the dollar, which was pegged to the gold.
Roosevelt and the U.S. delegation, especially Morgenthau and White, proposed a system whereby the ability of the United States to utter credit in the form of U.S. dollars was key. They proposed to have the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, tied to gold, upon which all other currencies would be fixed. This would allow for the might of the U.S. economy to play a direct role in guaranteeing credit for long-term productive development.
If you look at the original purpose of the IMF, it was for payments, for stability of payments. What happened after 1944 was that the United States dollar was decoupled from the gold. So it used to be that you could go into the U.S. Treasury and exchange dollars for gold. And in 1971, Nixon suspended that. So what we have now got is we have got a system of paper currency which always fails.
Articles of agreement were written in this book. Fred Vinson, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, said at the time that history is being written today. Ours is a mission of peace, not just lip service to the ideals of peace, but action, concrete action, designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation.
And they were there because the idea was that all of the countries, and at that time there were 44 of them, but now there are 188 members of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The idea was that when the world's wealth came out of hiding because it was put in a special trust fund for the benefit of humanity for 50 years. And the purpose of that was so that at the end of that 50-year period, there would be no other claims, and that wealth of the world would go to benefit humanity, and all of the countries that were members of the World Bank and IMF would be there to decide how that wealth was going to be spent.
The passage of 50 years that guest Karen Hughes talked about, that is, the redistribution of wealth, that was never to come. Not really. It was transformed to debt write-off, to the IMF World Bank's benefits through war, which benefited U.S. corporations. The year 2005, 50 years after the Bretton Woods IMF World Bank Conference, U.S. military forces were occupying Iraq. The economic forces of the International Monetary Fund IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization WTO were moving full speed ahead, implementing various economic reforms that would cause U.S.-based corporations to benefit, the likes of Bechtel and Halliburton. Shortly after the start of the U.S. war in Iraq, the U.S. got Iraq's debt of $39 billion canceled. Debt cancellation was being used as a tool of control by the World Bank, the IMF, and the wealthy creditor countries. The U.S. then passed a series of executive orders without any accountability to the Iraqi people that would, in essence, strip Iraq of its economic viability. Laid off 500,000 government workers, 400,000 of them employees of the Iraqi armed force. That's 8% of the workforce. Changed laws governing foreign investments to make Iraq one of the most liberalized economies in the developing world. It made it illegal for Iraqi farmers to plant saved seeds and to exchange knowledge freely. After U.S. moves, the groundwork was laid out for the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, who imposed the following conditions on Iraq. The privatization of all state-owned enterprises in the country except oil. That provided foreign corporations with control of vital sectors of Iraq's economy, which included partial foreign ownership of the oil industry. An end to food subsidies. The IMF and World Bank ended subsidized food rations, which was a lifeline for 60% of Iraq's population, their only protection against starvation. This facilitated the control of Iraq's market for food by corporate agribusiness. Liberalization of food prices. The World Bank eliminated regulations that kept food prices under control. The liberalization of food prices led to severe food shortage, even famine, in many countries, most recently in Niger and Mali.
So what the IMF was doing was they were combining all three of these terrible features. They were terrible for everyone else. They were good for the banks.
It's typical for the IMF and World Bank loans to come with a series of conditions, notably what they call structural adjustment programs, which usually means deregulation and privatization. And in many countries that are forced into a structural adjustment program are already in a quite weak state. The idea that it's necessary to privatize them, which typically leads to big job losses, and deregulate, which usually means a reduction in public services and higher charges, tends to exacerbate the situation. There are very few examples that I know of where there's been a major and significant structural adjustment program imposed on a country by the IMF and World Bank, which has led to economic success.
The IMF World Bank annual meeting, October 10th through the 12th of 2014. Another big event with high aspirations, yet it failed to deliver, especially on inequality, a striking disconnect, namely lack of a formal action plan for governments to address it. One reason, the rise of winner-take-all investments and political systems favoring the wealthy. The result, a trio of inequalities: income, wealth, and opportunity, which, if left unchecked, reinforce one another. Now the question is, how bad has inequality become despite the IMF World Bank efforts throughout the years?
In fact, this trend towards growing inequality is not unique to America's market economy. Across the developed world, inequality has increased.
The headlines are screaming at you. UK, only G7 country with wider inequality than at the turn of the century. The richest 10% control 54.1% of Britain's wealth, up from 51.5% in the year 2000 and 52% before the financial crisis, said Credit Suisse. Southern Africa, economic inequality fuels gender violence. If there is such a problem, then why this? World Bank, IMF urged to act on new inequality focus. IMF and World Bank should support wage and public investment-led recovery. Did this problem get addressed at the October conference?
We're likely to see more cases in more countries.
And we have to work now so that this is not the world's next case.
I say today, and please available now.
We need to make sure that bodies are promptly removed from the streets of our cities,
so we can, with under 48 hours, guarantee the evacuation of international medical staff, crucial for more people to go.
And we have written everything down, and we will hold you to it. Thank you.
We heard this morning from the European Commission and from the United States that both of those groups have now committed to medically evacuating health workers and other workers, the responders.
Emphasis on Ebola, plenty, not to mention water, global infrastructure facility, but not a real active action plan to tackle inequality. Here's what Mohammed El Erian, Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz and the Chairman of President Barack Obama's Global Development Council, has said on the issue. There were quite a few disconnects at the recently concluded annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Among the most striking was the disparity between participants' interests in discussions of inequality and the ongoing lack of a formal action plan for governments to address it. And in the closing press conference, it became evident that reform from within was a must.
But let me also say something about the discussion during the informal lunch of the Development Committee, during which we discussed the internal reform of the World Bank Group. One had an impression of resounding support for Jim. Virtually, I mean, not virtually, literally everyone, from the advanced countries, from low-income countries, from emerging countries, all the participants, all the attendees expressed admiration for the successful change that is going on within the bank.
A year ago, the governors gave us the great gift of the twin goals, a deadline for the end of extreme poverty and a focus on boosting shared prosperity. 6 months ago, the governors approved our strategy. And today I was very humbled to receive such a strong endorsement for the change agenda that we've put forward. We have made a lot of progress, and what I communicated to the governors was that we will continue to focus all of our efforts on improving our ability to serve clients.
I hope that we can exhaust all the opportunities under Plan A. And I don't think that our institution should move to Plan B until we have full certainty and massive disappointment that Plan A is definitely dead. I'm not prepared to declare that at this point, and I very strongly hope that the resolve of the institution, the pressure brought to bear by the members of this institution on all those who have not yet ratified, will deliver fruit in the not-too-distant future.
Now, I was hired into the World Bank by Dr. Ibrahim Shihada, who had been the general counsel of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And I have maintained credibility with the ministers of finance, who have appointed me to exercise their function in distributing the world's wealth to the world's people. If you look at what's going to be happening with the International Monetary Fund, they are going to return to their original purpose, and the state capture of the banking institutions is going to end.
The World Bank admitted the need for reform is most likely the outcome of pressure from member countries, basically saying either they're not doing enough or, well, the list is actually pretty long on how these institutions have failed to deliver. Here's a comparative study of why the World Bank must be reformed and why the IMF needs to be opposed. The globalization of market forces vigorously promoted by the World Bank has created greater inequality. Trillions of dollars in financial capital zooms around the world 24 hours a day, searching for the highest rate of interest. As a result, the richest 20% of the world's population receives 83% of the world's income.
Let's talk about the existing income inequality. The 85 richest people own as much wealth as 3.5 billion people. And 0.7% of the most wealthy, they have 40% of the world's wealth. And the 3% of the assets are owned by 70% of the people. Now, this is the income inequality that is existing. This has come into effect because the bankers have been printing currency and purchasing these assets and charging usury.
The World Bank does not promote development, but integrates the ruling elites of third world countries into the global system of rewards and punishments. By getting the elites onto a debt treadmill and promising them new cash if they implement policies written in Washington, the World Bank can effectively control third world policies. Perfect example of that is Mexico. The World Bank's emphasis on expanding exports has been disastrous for the environment. The World Bank encourages third world countries to expand exports so they will have more hard currency, that is dollars or yen, to make payments on their foreign debts. And this has led countries to overexploit their natural resources, such as cutting down their forests, which contributes to the greenhouse effect. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF has created a system of modern-day colonialism that saps the poor. It has put the global economy on a path of inequality. Debt repayments requires countries to cut spending on education, health, eliminate basic food and transportation subsidies, devalue national currencies to make exports cheaper, privatize national assets, and freeze wages. The IMF serves wealthy countries on Wall Street. Unlike a democratic system in which each member country would have an equal vote, rich countries dominate decision-making in the IMF because voting power is determined by the amount of money that each country pays into the IMF's quota system. It's a system of $1, one vote. The United States is the largest shareholder with a quota of 18%. Germany, Japan, France, Great Britain, and the U.S. combined control about 38%. Good time to look at why the IMF should be opposed. Looking at it here, promotes corporate welfare. It hurts workers and women. It bails out bankers, and bailouts deepen economic crisis as a result of the actions taken by the IMF. Now, in terms of where this came from, it came from global exchange. Maybe you're thinking it's easy to accuse the IMF, then throw a source, and then slam an organization as a result of that source that is supposed to help people rather than hurt them. Then, what about these people?
I'm here to protest the IMF and their debt slavery contracts to third world nations, and also to ask opinions about local food, to try and starve the supermarket agro-industrial model of its fuel, which is the easy money of the people.
Okay, what do you think is the biggest block to human progress right now?
The biggest block to human progress is the failure to realize gold as the ultimate wealth reserve, which all paper money is based upon. And if that were a free market for gold instead of it being commoditized, then the politicians wouldn't be allowed to steal from the people.
What they say about growth and returning to the markets, for us the employees, it will not bring anything new. We don't trust this, and we don't have any hopes. We know this only deals for the capital to profit, and not the employees.
The issue is not if Greece is returning to the markets. It will, but with how much interest? This is not a success because this has been possible due to the bloodshed of employees.
We must all react to this policy, which destroys the people, the employees, pensioners and youth. There are 1.5 million unemployed who don't have a future. We are a society which is deteriorating.
And now we're back to Bretton Woods, a full circle to the beginning of the program. Well, back in 2011, a Bretton Woods conference was held. It was sponsored by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. It was called INET's Bretton Woods Conference, Crisis and Renewal, International Political Economy at the Crossroads. Even the date itself is significant that 3 years later, the political economy is still at a crossroads. Important guest speakers at this particular event included the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, Gordon Brown.
More recently, the International Monetary Fund has had a conference on change in macroeconomics, and if you read between the lines, at some level, the fierceness with which they have applied their vision or recipes now is being drawn into question, and I think quite appropriately so. Olivier Blanchard led a conference there in early March. A number of our INET board members were participants in organizing and speaking at that conference. And so I believe the impetus to reorganization, which is really the basis on which we founded this organization, is now showing seeds, showing signs of moving forward, but albeit not quickly enough. In particular, I'll mention Robert Solo's fine presentation at the time of this IMF conference on fiscal policy and on the disharmony that he sees in the attempt to bring science to the analysis of fiscal policy, where he states at one point in his presentation that those who see low multipliers, in other words, little impact, tend to be those that don't want to see the state there, and those that see high multipliers tend to be those that do want to see the state play a more active role.
Can I say, first of all, what a real pleasure and privilege it is to be here in Bretton Woods. And so we have ended up with a situation where you cannot mention growth pact and exchange rate in the same communique, far less the same paragraph or the same sentence. So what started off as a major attempt at international cooperation, where there would be a global growth pact that would involve all the major economies of the world, has ended so far in an argument about terminology and how you define what is essential elements of building an agreement about growth and about the future of the economy.
Unfortunately, what happened was the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were hijacked by the bankers, the banking institutions. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have been dominated by the banking cartel. The banking cartel has ignored the underlying articles of the World Bank and IMF. And instead of the international monetary system being governed by the Bretton Woods institutions, they've been governed by the Group of 20, which has absolutely no legal basis.
Our time is up. So much for another program. Surely there's something that we left out. And the only way we can know for sure is for you to get in touch with us. Our links and addresses are below. We're looking forward to it. It's goodbye until next week.